Nearly 10 years ago, I joined an online forum for voice actors. I'd always wanted to voice act, and I was interested in producing radio dramas of what I was writing at the time. You see, my two best friends were getting ready to go to college, but I was still in high school. The three of us were all writers, and often we'd brainstorm by throwing ideas at each other. We'd role play, take quizzes in characters, research, and sometimes we would just talk about dreams, all ways we'd just exchange notes on what we were working on. I'd only known them for a year or two, but I was so happy to have people to share my joy of stories with. I had people to share my stories with. But they'd be leaving soon, and college was going to put them at odds with my more rigid high school schedule, so I thought having something new that they could listen to on their own time and come back to me about would be a great avenue for keeping in touch. One radio play I'd come up with was a comedy I had in the works that was one part fan fiction and the other part parody. The story itself wasn't what's important, though. It was the first audition I received for my own original character, because that first audition was from a user by the name of Rashinban. I remember clearly getting that audition, seeing that it was for my character, the one I had created as my type, and freaking out. I sent it off to one of my friends, and then I spent the next several minutes, possibly hour, gushing about how perfect the voice was. We were both smitten, but the more I listened, the more quickly I fell in love. I cast him right away, ecstatic that the perfect voice showed up for the character without any competition. I knew there was no way I'd cast anyone else. I'd already started hearing this Rashinban in my head when I wrote. Admittedly, I was obsessed, and I spent hours searching every nook and cranny I could online to find out who this guy was. I eventually learned his name was Cody. He was an artist of unbelievable skill. He loved anime, and his style at the time was a blend of Clamp, Bleach, and Naruto, with a little bit of early Kenshin thrown in. But the thing I was interested in most was finding out that he was a writer, too. I wanted to know more about his stories. I could only discern so much from the photo bucket I had happened across. I wanted to know what he was writing. After a year, with some encouragement from my friend, I finally contacted him and asked if we could chat on AIM. It was a rocky start getting to know him. The first night, my friend stayed up to ask him the questions I was too afraid to ask, like how to pronounce his last name. And I would timidly skirt around the fact that I knew a lot about him by asking questions that I already knew the answers to. He was preoccupied with another girl, so it was hard to keep him talking. I binge watched Scrubs, which was his favorite show at the time, just so I could have a conversation starter. I stayed up until 3, sometimes 4 in the morning, despite having school in a few hours, just to connect with this guy. And it eventually paid off. And as he came to trust me, he began sharing with me the stories of his I was so curious about. The first of them was a webcomic he'd been planning with a friend that he was certain would never get off the ground. He was writing the chapters alone at this point, but he loved the characters and wanted to keep it going for as long as he could, even if he'd never be able to make it into a real comic. I devoured chapter after chapter with these characters. In a way, I became the first fan of this story since no one else but he and his friends had ever really read them. I had to talk with him for hours about his characters and the story, about all the parts that I loved and what stood out the most. The stories he shared with me were beautiful, not just because of their content, but because of the trust it meant he was putting in me. And now, those first stories he shared with me have evolved into something that we're actually sharing in together. But it's funny. I started out at a voice acting forum for voiceover work, primarily. I loved acting, and I'd always wanted to be a voice actor. I still do. But I had convinced myself that writing was only a hobby, no matter how much it consumed me and shaped my life. Because it was such a constant, I was certain it was something I would always have, and the last thing I wanted to do was get sick of it. But the truth is, no matter how many stories I consume and produce, I can't get sick of it. Because stories fuel me. The story of how Cody and I got together, the story of how my best friends were what led me to him, and the stories that we have all created are the very things that give my life meaning. They give me a reason to live. I don't write as a hobby. I write to share the experiences and relationships I have in hopes of recapturing that moment where I suddenly remember that it's okay to want to be alive. I write in hopes that my stories can connect with others in the same way that stories connect to me. And it's easy to think that when everyone is sharing their stories all at once, that your voice isn't all that special because there are so many that are saying the exact same thing as you. It's easy to feel redundant and meaningless. I feel it all the time. But when I'm able to remember that there was only one voice that could have ever voiced that character for me, I have to remind myself that sometimes that one voice makes all the difference for someone. So that's what I'm going to start doing. For the first time in years now, I want to really share my stories. It might not make a difference for anyone, but I hope it will for me.